Selection are going to be your friend. Throughout Illustrator, you're going to want to be able to select individual points or paths or objects or groups of objects. And so using the selection tool and the direct selection tool, you're going to be able to learn how to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. I am just, first of all, going to draw a couple of rectangles here, or squares. And one thing that you can do is you can swap the properties here. So you swap fill and stroke. And so one of those rectangles now has a fill of red and one has a fill of blue. So direct selection tool is this white tool, and the selection tool is this black arrow, and they serve different purposes. So I'm going to start with the selection tool. I'm going to click on my object. You can see that bounding box appears around it, which means it's selected. And then I can click and drag it around. I can resize it this time. If I press shift, it'll constrain proportions. That's one thing that's a little different than Photoshop, is that you have to press shift to constrain those proportions, right? So if you have a perfect square and you want to just scale it up, you can do that. So that's one thing that you can do with the direct selection tool, is to scale. You can move, and then if you come up next to the corner, you'll see this little bent arrow up here, and now you can rotate. So using the selection tool, you can resize, rotate, reposition, and rescale your artwork. If you press shift while you're rotating, it's going to constrain it to 45-degree increments. So that's useful when wanting to be mathematically precise in those rotations. So that is the selection tool, direct selection tool. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to select my object. Now, if I drag an anchor, if it's all selected, it'll actually move the entire thing. However, if I click directly on that one anchor point, now I can change that corner, right? And if I press shift, it can be straight up and down on one direction. It makes it easier to do. So you can play around with that modifier key as well. If I click and drag across two anchor points, now I can change an edge, a side, okay? And if with those two selected, if I grab that widget and drag it, it's only going to affect those two corners. So I can then play around and change up individual anchor points by using this direct selection tool. So if I click on the anchor and then drag it, it only affects one of them, right? If I click on, here I'm going to undo that, but if I click on the actual object and I see all of those widgets and click and drag, now it's going to affect all of them at once. And it's kind of in a goofy shape as it is, but you can see that it affects all of them at the same time. And so direct selection tool allows you to select shapes. It allows you to select individual anchors. It allows you to select handles, which you'll learn how to use to pull and to tweak the shape refinements, the edges of those. And it allows you to select multiple anchor points on different objects at the same time. Right? So you can do it that way. One thing to keep in mind when using the selection and direct selection is that you can select an object and then you can right click on it and you can go to arrange and you can send it to the back. Okay, so you can stack those objects accordingly. If you use the selection tool and drag a bounding box around the whole thing, using the contextual taskbar, you could group those objects together. And so now, now when I move it around, they're grouped together, right? If I want to go in and edit an individual object, I can double click on it, and this blue line appears at the top. That means I'm in isolation mode. And so now I can move and manipulate the objects within that group. And then if I click on that bar, they're grouped again, but they're just rearranged in a different position. So again, this is going to take a little bit of time to play around with, to get familiar with, but really learn how to use the selection tool and the direct selection tool so that you can master Adobe Illustrator.